So, welcome to our event From Francis Xavier to Now, Interreligious Dialogue and the Jesuits in Japan. I'm Aaron Willis, Director of the Bannon Forum and the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. And this is the third in our four-part series on the Jesuits' interreligious dialogue in Asia. And this series has been co-sponsored by the Jesuit School of Theology and the Department of Religious Studies here at Santa Clara University. Our series will conclude next week with an event on the Jesuits in China and the Chinese rights controversy, featuring Thierry Menard from Taiwan. And this series offers several opportunities to reflect on the Jesuit tradition and its implications within and beyond our own institution. First, it's an opportunity to explore the history of the Jesuits as a way of understanding the foundations of the Jesuit spiritual and intellectual tradition. For instance, what can we learn from these historical encounters that speak to our current context today? And importantly, this process of historical exploration must include a critical assessment of the limitations and failings of past practices and attitudes. Second, it offers us a chance to focus on the values of conversation and dialogue to seek truth and understanding as part of our mission as a Jesuit institution. And this understanding must serve as a foundation for meaningful and continuing relationships of mutuality. It is not a vision of dialogue where we always be in complete agreement, or where one side's main motivation and definition of success is having brought someone else over to their point of view. Rather, we seek encounters that open new insights and possibilities for all, as our mission is fundamentally about the intellectual and spiritual exploration, which serves to transform our world into a more humane place. I'm excited for tonight's event and the ways in which it will pick up on a lot of these themes and opportunities in our conversation. So our event tonight will start with a lecture by Dr. Ruben Habito, who I'll introduce in a moment. And it'll be followed by a conversation and Q&A led by Dr. Sarita Tamayo-Moraga of the Religious Studies Department here at Santa Clara University. And as we go through tonight's event, feel free to put questions in the Q&A button down below. And when we get to the Q&A portion, we will be able to pick those questions up as we go. So don't feel like you have to wait till the end to put those there. We will be able to read them and use them at any point. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Ruben Habito, who is Professor of World Religions and Spirituality and the Director of Spiritual Formation at the Perkins School of Theology at SMU. He's been teaching at SMU since 1989, and Dr. Habito received a doctorate from Tokyo University. His work is centered on topics ranging from Japanese medieval Buddhism to themes in comparative theology and spirituality and socio-ecological engagement. Relevant publications among many, include Zen and Spiritual Exercises, Passive Awakening and Transformation from Orbis Books in 2013, The Gospel Among Religions, Christian Ministry, Theology and Spirituality in a Multi-Religious World, co-edited with David Brockman, and finally, Healing Breath, Zen for Buddhists and Christians in a Wounded World. In addition to these publications, Dr. Habito has also founded the Maria Cannon Zen Center in Dallas, Texas. And we welcome Dr. Habito and look forward to a wonderful discussion. And I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm honored and very glad to have been invited to offer some reflections on this series on interreligious dialogue and the work of Jesuits in Asia. And my task for this evening is to focus on Japan, because I know that you've already covered India with Francis Clooney and Tibet with Thomas Katoy. And next week, you will be covering China with Thierry Menard. So I have things to say also, because all of these aspects of Jesuit work in these Asian countries are interrelated and mutually influence one another. But because you already have time for those other countries, I'll focus on Japan. And one of the things that Aaron did not introduce is that the fact that I had been blessed to be with the Jesuits in Japan for 20 years. I was born and raised in the Philippines, and then in 1970, I entered the Jesuits in the 60s, and then in 1970, I was sent to Japan by the General Superior then, Father Arupe, and then I was he already superior, or was it still his predecessor? Anyway, but then Father Arupe became the superior when I was in Japan, and I know the people that I will be introducing in a way that really makes me feel so blessed in having worked with them personally. And then the task, though, is not so much to harp on the past, but to learn from the past and see what we can take from what we have learned in the past to be able to address the current issues that we face as a global society, as a global community, both globally as well as locally in our own respective communities. So with that in mind, allow me to share with you some vignettes from a PowerPoint I prepared so that I will be given at least a sense of direction and I don't go all over the place in my delivery. I have about 30, 40 minutes to share something, and then Sarita will be giving me some prompts in our conversation, and she will also present some of her views because what she does is also related to what I'll be saying toward the end. And then we can have an overall conversation with your questions and comments that you may post anytime in the chat box or in the Q&A. So let me begin by sharing a slide. Am I able to, do I need to push share screen here? Oh yes, okay. And I'll push share screen, and you're peeking at my email, so don't do that. But you can peek at this big one. So the title that I've given to this short presentation is From Francis Xavier to Now, Interreligious Dialogue and the Jesuits in Japan. So beginning with Francis Xavier, he is of course a giant figure that stands in the history of the Catholic Church. And before he came to Japan as a missionary, he had also spent time already in India. And then somehow his heart burning with love for people, wanting to share with them the message of Christ, led him from India after he had already been working there as a missionary and had been able to win converts to Christ. Then he sailed on a ship that led him to Japan. And then after Japan, he had hoped that he would be able to go and present the gospel also in China, but somehow he never was able to reach China, and he died right after leaving Japan. So now I will not go further into his biography, otherwise it'll take another half an hour, but we'll just summarize his approach to the religious world of Japan when he came. So he arrived in Japan in the fall of 1549, and in arriving, his main goal was to tell the Japanese about salvation in Jesus Christ, inviting them to convert and be baptized. So that was the theological framework of the missionaries then. Those people who don't know about Christ need to be saved, and so we need to tell them about the salvation in Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, he arrived in Japan, and then he realized that there was such a high level of culture and of spirituality already in Japan for centuries. So he got that point that he needed to have conversations with them so that he could at least present to them the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ in the ways that they were prepared to do so, namely in intellectual conversations and in cultured settings. So with that, he sought conversations and engaged in public debates with Buddhist priests, seeking to prove the truth of the Christian gospel vis-a-vis Buddhist doctrines and views, which he thought were in error because, of course, they were not according to what he understood as the truth given by God's revelation in Jesus Christ. But at the same time, he acknowledged the value of Buddhism for upholding an upright moral life for its followers, while condemning their failings. He already had heard that there were also some moral failings among the Buddhists at that time, and so he lamented that. And at the same time, he acknowledged that Buddhism was also serving as a vehicle for them to live a moral life. And so he needed to give credit for that, although he still felt that he needed to convince them that they were in error and to believe in Jesus Christ. Now, in saying these summary things, I would like to just point out two references that will be helpful for those who would like to delve further into this, so I won't go into detail. There is a very, very illuminating and insightful article by Father Adolfo Nicolas, whom we all know as the late Superior General of the Society of Jesus. And so there he describes the theological approach of Francis Xavier as well as Balignano, and then goes on to contemporary times. So in fact, he has covered what I wanted to say in this article. So if you read this, you will really get a sense of what has happened in the past. And now the question is, what now? What now, my love? How can we approach the future based on what we have learned from the past? So I have received a lot of hints from Father Nicolas also, by the way, whom I was privileged to have as a theology professor when I was in the Theologate in Japan. By the way, again, so that you don't get any misunderstandings, I was a Jesuit for 25 years, 20 of them in Japan. And then after that, I was blown by another wind across the Pacific. And so I have left the Jesuits and in 1989 landed in Dallas, and I've been stuck here ever since. Well, not stuck in a bad way, but I have found my new place in Dallas, sharing what I have learned from the Jesuits in a Methodist and in an in an ecumenical Christian context. So I continue to have the heart of a Jesuit, although I am no longer formally in the organization, and I'm grateful with all my life. In any case, another article that anyone who is interested in the details of Francis Xavier's discovery or attitude toward Japanese Buddhism is by a scholar, I believe he's from Switzerland, Urs Up, and he was in Japan for a long time, maybe he's still there. St. Francis's Discovery of Japanese Buddhism, a chapter in the European Discovery of Buddhism. This is in the Eastern Buddhist New Series, volume 30 in 1997. So anyone who is interested in references, please look them up. And these are with Aaron now. The slide is with Aaron. So if you ask him, he will send you the references if you're not able to scribble them down at this point. In any case, after Xavier, another great figure that we are invited to look at is Alessandro Balignano, another Italian who was very influential in the work of the Jesuits, not only in Japan, but throughout Asia. Just focusing on his own approach, he encouraged his followers, both the Jesuits and the other Christians, to study Buddhism and engage in dialogue with Buddhists to, quote, refute their errors. So at least he had that sense that we need to study what they believe so that we can debate with them and be able to refute them and tell them that the truth is in Christ. But he took care not to attack persons, nor to offend, nor wound anyone. And he took it as an important point to be respectful and considerate. So in his attacks, he attacked themes and views, but not persons. He would not go ad hominem. He would not denigrate persons. And he then, and his approach to Buddhism can be described as something of a humanistic spirit, looking for signs of goodness and truth to be found in the midst of the error that he thought they were mired in because they were not aware of the message of truth in Jesus Christ. Again, I'm just summarizing the high points here. And so after a while, after the initial booming success of Jesuits and other missionaries who were able to convert hundreds of thousands of Christians or Japanese into Christianity, and then there were living communities of Christianity for several decades, perhaps even almost a century, from about 1549 when Francis Xavier arrived until 1639 or so, when the expulsion of missionaries became more clear-cut, and also the prohibition of Christianity was a very strict procedure in society. That 90 years, or almost a century, was a very very fertile ground for Christian life and for Christian community Christian community life. But it was stopped abruptly by that government policy because the government was afraid that with these missionaries coming in, they were bound to then come and follow with their gunships and then take over Japan. They saw what had happened to the Philippines, where the missionaries came and were successful in winning the hearts of the people. And then the conquistadores came and took over and were colonized. And they did not want that to happen to their country. So they took a strict stance, banning all the missionaries and persecuting and then also executing Christians who would not renounce their faith. And so we know of that period of martyrdom, the Nagasaki martyrs, but also hundreds, thousands of martyrs. If you are interested in that period of Japanese history, I recommend the book by Endo Shusaku entitled Silence. It's a novel actually, but Martin Scorsese made a very moving picture out of that, precisely entitled Silence by Martin Scorsese. I recommend it if there's anyone who is interested in this period and who has not seen that movie. So these are the highlights of those centuries. And so in 1868, there was a new government, there was a new mood in Japan, and so Japan was reopened to the rest of the world. Japan felt that she was now behind in so many ways, so she wanted to learn from Western countries. And part of learning from Western countries is that there were also other religions there, so they said, well, okay, let the missionaries come in and do their work here. So freedom of religion was proclaimed. Christian missionaries re-entered, not just the Catholics, but also Protestant missionaries of different denominations to renew Christian activities. By the way, during this time, there were groups of Christians who had managed to maintain their community life as Christians in hidden ways. These are the so-called hidden Christians of Japan, and they have survived through those centuries, and they were discovered again after the Meiji Restoration by some missionaries. And that's another dramatic part of the history of Japan, which I won't go into. So with this intervening period, then a new period of Christian mission to Japan came. And especially after the Second World War, there was a new surge of missionaries coming to Japan. Now, abbreviating all of that, I would like to now come to the post-Vatican II era since 1965. And it is the spirit of Nostra Aetate, the declaration that was part of the very groundbreaking statements of the Second Vatican Council that changed the whole attitude of missionaries as well as Christians, not just all over the world, but specifically in a mission country like Japan. I will read to you that passage that is truly like a liberating beacon for a new approach to other religions. When the Nostra Aetate in its second clause says, the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and life, those precepts and teachings, which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all. And so this statement of the Vatican Council in Nostra Aetate was like a Magna Carta for Christians to really explore other religions, seeking what is true and holy, knowing that they come from the same God who is the author of all truth and holiness. So no longer any a priori or predetermined condemnations that all of those other religions are in error. So it's a total shift. You can call it a 180-degree shift in relating to other religions. So now the point is to look for what is true and holy in these religions. Now let me just focus on three giants, three Jesuits who are very influential in the work of the Jesuits in Japan in relating with other religions. One is Father Heinrich Dumulin, a German who was born and raised in the Alsace region. That's why his name is more French-like. And then there is Father LaSalle, French-like names, but they're both German. They come from the same Alsace region. And so, and I'll talk about Father LaSalle later, but Father Heinrich Dumulin is known for his scholarship. He had been researching on Zen Buddhism for many, many years, and his achievement still is being referenced by many scholars now, although other scholars have pointed out that there were some loopholes in what he had written. But in any case, his 2-volume Zen Buddhism, a history covering the history of Zen in Japan, in India, China, and Japan, is still a landmark study that any scholar who wants to know about Zen Buddhism needs to consult. And he gives very, very detailed and very, eloquent descriptions of the various Zen masters that are part of Zen history. And then another giant is Father Hugo Enomiya LaSalle, who even in the 1930s and 1940s had already begun exploring Buddhism by joining Zen meditation retreats. And so with the Vatican Council and with Nostra Aetate, he felt more free now to go on and explore Zen, not just intellectually and in a scholarly academic way as Father Dumulin had done, but by actually going to the Zen temples and monasteries and participating in Zen retreats. After many years of doing that, he had attained some sense of confidence in his Zen meditation. And he had also been, of course, directing individuals in the spiritual exercises. And so it was a way of integrating his vision from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius with his experience in Zen that made him, that inspired him to go back to Europe for several months every year and offer retreats there in Zen style. And so these retreats were really very popular in Europe at that time that he was giving them. So every year for some certain months of the year, he would be in Europe. He would offer Zen retreats in different places. There was a center in Dietfurt, Germany, where he offered most of his retreats, but he also traveled to other European countries. It is said that he also led a retreat in which the Queen of Spain at that time also participated. So he was the person who introduced Zen to many Europeans, and it's still an ongoing tradition. He himself came to the Zen master that I was also privileged to learn from and received the confirmation and authorization to be a Zen teacher from that Zen master, Yamada Koun Roshi, which I can talk about if needed. But Yamada Koun Roshi is a Zen master who had many disciples, including Christians, Jews, and Buddhists, of course, but those Christians who then went back to their countries, including the Philippines, Europe, and then the United States, are continuing to lead Zen centers in the respective places. And that's one of the aspects I'll be talking about in the latter part, or rather toward the end of my talk. Now, another giant that we cannot fail to mention is Father Kakichi Kadowaki. He had also gone to Yamada Roshi for a while, but he felt attracted more to another Zen master then, Rinzai master named Omori Sogen Roshi. And so Omori Sogen is also known for his combining Zen with martial arts and with archery and with different other cultural forms in Japan, like calligraphy and so on. So Father Kadowaki really was able to cultivate these arts in himself, and also was declared and named Zen master by Omori Sogen Roshi. And so it was Father Dumulin, and then after Father Dumulin retired, Father Kadowaki, who managed a an institute at Sophia University, the Sophia University's Institute of Asian Religions, or Toyo Shukyo Kenkyujo, which hosted annual lectures, not just a single lecture, but a whole week long of lectures every year by different spiritual leaders of Japan, most of them Buddhist of different denominations, but also Shinto and shamanism and so on, in dialogue with Christianity. And I looked at a recent webpage of Sophia University, and I'm so happy to note that they're continuing this lecture series with prominent figures in Japan right now. And so the work of the Jesuits goes on in this kind of encounter with other traditions. And let me also mention another aspect or another luminary that came from the work of Jesuits in Japan, who is now based in the United States. Father Robert Kennedy is a Jesuit priest who worked in Japan for 8 years and ordained in 1965. He returned to the US, and since returning, he has been teaching at St. Peter's College, or now St. Peter's University in New Jersey. That's how he would pronounce it himself. And at the same time, he continued his Zen practice, sometimes going back to Japan under Yamada Koun Roshi. And then he went to practice with Maezumi Taizan Roshi, and subsequently under Bernie Glassman Roshi, and had been given the designation of Zen Master by Bernie Glassman in 1997, and has continued, I miss a B there, a D, and has continued as a Jesuit priest and Zen Master since, and he still is continuing to lead Zen groups. Every morning he sits and offers Zoom meditation retreats at his Morning Star Zendo, based in New Jersey. And he has also authorized at least 17 persons now to become his Dharma heirs. And many of them are either Catholic nuns or priests. One of them is Father Kevin Hunt, a Trappist who he is shown here ordaining as a Zen teacher at that time. So these are some of the highlights of people who did what. But now I'd like to focus more on theological underpinnings of Jesuit engagement with religious others based on what I have seen in Japan. What are the theological frameworks that propelled the Jesuits to engage with others in Japan? Well, first of all, in the era of Saint Francis Xavier, the phrase that looms in the minds and hearts of all Christians, especially the Catholics, is this very, very imposing sentence: extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, no salvation. And that was firmly entrenched in the mind of the missionaries, and that's what gave them the zeal to want to convert everybody to become disciples of Christ and to become members of the church so that they would be saved, just by logic from following that theological dictum and that theological axiom. It was almost like an axiom that it comes from Saint Cyprian in the early centuries and was ratified by the Roman Catholic Church. So this so-called good news turned out to be bad news for many, because the missionaries came, and with the power of their European culture and European military, they went about preaching the gospel, the so-called good news for them, but it became bad news for many people who received that, because they had to relinquish their previous ways, their previous religions, and their artifacts of their previous religion were considered to be idols and demonic. So a lot was destroyed. I won't go into, but with this extra ecclesiam nulla salus attitude, there was a lot of destruction that the Western missionaries caused in many of those countries that they brought the good news to. That's the irony of Christian mission that we still have to continue to reflect on and really say mea culpa for. So now, post-Vatican, with Nostra Aetate, what happened to extra ecclesiam nulla salus? I was preparing for ordination, taking theology in Japan, and I took ecclesiology with a professor who was born in Spain and came to Japan as a missionary and then got his doctorate from the Gregorian in Rome. So he was fully orthodox in that regard. And what he taught us about this phrase is, well, the ecclesia that we're talking about here is no longer just the concrete Roman Catholic historical living church, but the ecclesia ab Abel, namely of all of those, the gathering of all of those just and righteous who have been made just and righteous by the grace of God because they follow their conscience. And so even the son of Adam and Eve, Abel in the Hebrew scriptures, is a model of that because he followed his conscience and worshiped God according to the way his heart dictated. And so all people who have followed their hearts are following, in fact, the grace of the Holy Spirit, who is the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And so in that regard, the famous phrase of Karl Rahner, anonymous Christians, is something that came up to mind. And so that's what I learned, that this phrase does not necessarily mean the concrete historical human organization of the Roman Catholic Church, but the church that includes everyone who is saved. And so in that sense, if ecclesia means everyone who is saved because of their because they follow their good conscience through the grace of God in Jesus Christ, then outside of those who will be saved, no one will be saved. It becomes a tautology, in fact. So anyway, that's another theological conundrum that I'd like to discuss in another forum, but that's how I was given instruction in theology, that we are now able to see that, not in that narrow way, but as a way of opening ourselves to those who will be saved by the grace of Jesus Christ, but who are not yet able to know who Jesus Christ is. That's the statement of the so-called inclusivistic worldview that Alan Ray's had classified in his threefold classic typology of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. So now, since Nostra Aetate, how has the work of Jesuits vis-a-vis other religious traditions been characterized? There are now many positive and proactive approaches in engaging Japanese spiritual traditions, including Shinto, Buddhism in its many forms, shamanism, Confucianism, and Taoism, which are also influential in Japan in different ways, toward mutual learning and enrichment. So the lecture series at Sophia University that I mentioned is among those occasions and events when this kind of mutual learning is taking place. And the theological presupposition here is to bring all things that are true and holy found in Asian religions and spiritual traditions into full light, acknowledging them as such and to bring them into encounter with the gospel. So that is the underlying motivation of interreligious dialogue, as I am able to view it in the work of Jesuits in Japan. Now, again, abbreviating many intervening comments, it's now an era that calls us to go beyond those three categories of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. I do not have time to discuss the strengths as well as the weaknesses of these three, but now in an era where we are able to acknowledge the fact of many religions living together in the same global community, how can we relate to one another in ways that can be creative and constructive and mutually healing and cooperative toward healing the wounds of our earth? That is the task of the hour. And so what can we learn from the work of Jesuits in Japan in that regard? And also in connection, there are 4 points that come in that regard. One is mutual hospitality. An example of this is the inter-monastic dialogue that had been conducted for a good number of years between Christian monks, including Benedictine and other monastic orders from Europe, including some Christians and some Jesuits in Japan, and Zen monastics, Zen monasteries. So in one year, they would all congregate in one temple where they would gather and have a time of meditation together, and they would have liturgical celebrations. And then the other year, they would go to a monastery somewhere in Europe, hosted by either the Benedictines or the Cistercians and so on, and share in the silence and share in their way of being monastics together. That has been going on, mutual hospitality. And then through that and through many other encounters, there have been interreligious friendships that have formed, and those friendships are transforming both sides. Then there's, of course, cooperation in shared task of human society in local and national and global levels, including issues of justice, poverty, and ecological healing. And then there is the ongoing mutual learning from different views of human condition and ultimate reality, which can be described as the task of what we know as comparative theology, what Francis Clooney and I trust Thomas Catoy also talked about. So with these different ways of engaging religious others, I also already mentioned the intermonastic dialogue, so I will just go to the next slide. The question, there's another question that comes in the light of what the Jesuits have done, but not just the Jesuits there, but more and more across the world are asking the question of multi-religious belonging. For example, as I mentioned, Father LaSalle, a staunch Jesuit priest, was named Zen master by a Buddhist, and he exercised that role as a Zen master to many, Christians or not, and so did Father Kadowaki, and so does Father Robert Kennedy. How does that affect their understanding of being Christian? And how can one be Zen Buddhist and fully Christian at the same time without sacrificing or compromising one or the other or both? That's an ongoing question that calls for examination and reflection. And now the other, so I would like to just, Sarita, of course, would have something to say about that because she herself is a Zen teacher and has been practicing Zen for many, many years now. So this is something I hope we can have some discussions on. But now I would like to offer a theological perspective that may at least give us some intellectual framework for understanding the directions that we're heading. For me, the passage in Ephesians always jumps out. Ephesians 1:9-10. God made known to us the mystery of the divine will, according to God's good pleasure, purposed in Christ, to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. This passage is something that my New Testament teacher, when I was in the Jesuit novitiate, really also highlighted. And he would give us the Greek term, to bring all things to reach their fulfillment with Christ as head. Anake phalaiosatai tapanta in to theo. And so anyway, that's a Greek phrase that we were able to listen so much that it stuck with us. Anake phalaiosatai, to bring all things, to integrate all things under Christ. Now that sounds like an inclusivist position. So you might say that's still triumphalistic. No, I would like to bring that and make that reverse. And my hint is from Raimundo Panikkar. He was then named Raimundo, and then he changed his name in his later books to Raimon Panikkar. He wrote The Unknown Christ of Hinduism in 1965 as his doctoral dissertation for the Gregorian. And then toward the end of his life, he, I believe 2010 or so, before he died, he was invited to give the Gifford Lectures, and the Gifford Lectures were published later after he died in 2013 as The Rhythm of Being. And here he gives a cosmotheandric vision of reality wherein we are all things in heaven and earth. and all things are taken up in a cosmic dance that begins in the here and now as we open the eyes of our hearts to this divine mystery in our midst. I'm talking about all of this, including all of the religions with their contributions of all that is true and holy, acknowledged as such as coming from the same source, but now with a different angle that can enrich all of us. And so we can call this, or I can call this, inclusivism turned inside out, or inclusivism in reverse, I would like to put it. It's not so much that we have Christ and they're coming to us and we have the completion and you don't, but precisely stating the opposite. We Christians cannot be complete until we also accept in our hearts the gifts that God has given to all in the religious traditions and be able to relate to them in a way that can complete all of us in that one big cosmic theandric reality, so that we are all able to join in and are brought into the harmony of the divine dance. In short, to borrow the words of Richard Rohr in a title of a book he wrote, everything belongs. That's what I learned from the Jesuits in Japan. Thank you. I can now you have dismissed your servant, and I will now stop my sharing and come back to the main screen.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Ruben, and I'll introduce Sarita now, and then you all can have a conversation, and eventually we'll open it up to question and answers from the audience. So before I introduce Sarita, I just want to mention again, feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A tab. We've had one come in on the chat, but it's good they're more visible to everyone if they're in the Q&A. So feel free to do that as we go along. We look forward to engaging conversation. So Dr. Sarita Tamayo-Moraga is the senior lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies here at Santa Clara University. She received her BA from the University of Texas and her PhD in History of Christianity from the University of Chicago in 2002. Before coming to Santa Clara, she taught at the San Jose City College, and she joined Santa Clara in the spring of 2003. Her research focuses on comparative mysticisms with a focus on Zen and Catholicism, the use of mindfulness and pedagogy, and transformative scholarship and learning. So thank you very much, Dr. Tamayo-Moraga, for being here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Aaron, and also thank you, Thomas. I know you're out there for this wonderful series, but most of all, of course, thank you, Ruben. So I have far too many questions, but first, perhaps I will focus on the dual belonging piece that was a thread throughout your talk, and the historic and very important shift from no salvation outside the church to Nostra Aetate, and Catholics can search for what is good and holy in other religions. And then again, of course, narrow down to Asia and your own experience in Japan. So having often myself been asked, how can I be a Zen teacher and Catholic? And remembering that 7 years ago, Ruben, you and Thomas and I were in an interfaith retreat together, led by the wonderful and lamented late Andre Delbecq. May he rest in peace.
Bless his heart.
Yes. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your work on really comparative theology around the Ignatian exercises and Zen practice. And in particular, I'm thinking of your book on that and your experiences leading retreats that are simultaneously, from what I understand, working on the Ignatian exercises and sitting Zazen. Could you tell us some about that?
Well, to speak on a personal note, and I borrow this from a good friend of mine who was also a Christian, an Episcopal Christian, and a Zen teacher with whom I had very engaging conversations at the time. Her name is Susan Postal. She described to me her understanding of herself as someone who receives nourishment from two IVs directly into her. One will be the Christian tradition, and then the other will be the Zen Buddhist tradition. And they somehow enter into her body and they become mutually reinforcing and enhancing to make her who she is. And so in that regard, when I sit with practitioners in Zen, and for example, if they are from a Christian tradition, I would be able to come up with Christian terms that would make sense to them, to bring them to a deeper level into that realm that is beyond words and phrases. Now, there are also a good number who are now resistant to the Christian tradition, having been wounded by it from their experiences in their youth or childhood and so on, and are no longer want to be identified with that. So for such individuals, I am careful also to simply point out and use terms that will not be blocks to them, and in fact allow them to go and enter into that place of stillness that makes them more comfortable in knowing that they can be at home there. So in Zen, we are always reminded of the fact that words are like a finger pointing to the moon. They are simply pointers, and we're not, so the finger itself does not give the light, but it's simply something that points to the light. And if you follow the direction of the finger, aha, brilliant. But people use words in a way that we get stuck in them, and then we argue about the finger, what its shape is and what its direction is. And that's where the human fallibility can bog us down. So for me, receiving the nourishment from both traditions, using the words that I have learned from both my Jesuit formation and also from my Zen formation, somehow whenever I sit with people, what in Buddhism is called skillful means can come out without my thinking, now I shall use this and so on. Somehow if you're there sitting with people, they come up. The things that that need to be said somehow come up, and you ask, where did that come from? And it can only give us joy. If we sit in silence with an open heart, somehow that realm opens itself to us, and we can only be grateful that it's there, so we can trust that we're in good hands.
Thank you. I feel like I want to digest that, but I know time is of the essence. But thank you, Ruben. And on a side note, kind of odd, Susan Postel and I are Dharma sisters.
Oh,
Darlene,
same teacher.
we're
I
both
see. Yes, I remember.
Dharma heirs of Darlene Cohen.
Ah, good to know that. I see.
So goodness gracious. So, but to bring us back to our fireside chat now, or perhaps bookcase chat, I was struck by another thread that I heard in your talk around sort of the widening of the concept of ecclesia. So in terms of ecclesiology, and especially in the shift from no salvation outside the church to openness to the religious other, and that now the church teaches we can search for what is good and holy in the religious other. How has your Zen practice and Zen teaching widened your understanding of ecclesia, either from a theological standpoint, more abstract, or a personal standpoint?
Thank you. That is really a very pointed question, and it cuts right to the heart of what I need to work on theologically from here on. How has my Zen practice shed light on my understanding of ecclesia, the gathering of those who will be saved? Well, again, from a comparative theological perspective, if I may use some highfalutin language here. So in Buddhism, we refer to terms like Buddha nature, or that all beings are endowed with Buddha nature, except that they don't see it, or they're mired in a lot of karmic muck that prevents them from really embodying it. And so somehow many correlations come to me in a way that I can understand what sin is. Not so much an inherent evil that exists ontologically, but precisely as something that covers up the innate goodness that we have. From a Christian perspective, the divine image is something endowed to all of those, to all God's beloved creatures. But somehow we fail to live up to that. Why so? And so again, that's a theological question. And Buddhism has a very helpful answer in that our karmic baggage weighs us down, or the things that we do that are harmful precisely affect not just ourselves, but others. And so it becomes a social sin, or rather a societal level of sinfulness that we're all mired in. The Buddhists have their language for that as their the karmic baggage that people carry. And so for me, Zen is a way of sitting still and allowing that muck to settle and somehow get out of the way. There's a book by James Martin called Everything You Wanted to Know About the Jesuits, or something to that effect. And there he talks about a passage about discernment. And he says, it's like muddy waters. And if you just pour it all of a sudden in the glass, then the water is icky and muddy and so on, and you can't see through. So just let it stand, let it be still, and sooner or later that stillness will enable the water to settle down, and the muck will be on one level so that you can easily separate it and see through it, and then you will be able to see through that water. And that clear water is the divine nature that is embedded and which we are all endowed with, that we are now able to see in a way that whatever karmic baggage we may have been carrying can at least be set aside so that we can overcome them. So that's one way of seeing those things in a concrete imagery. But that's just the beginning of an answer. I'm still working on that.
So many amazing questions have come in. So I will ask one last question before turning to our wonderful audience questions, including Thomas's question in the chat. So if you could only pick one, well, perhaps let me restate this. How has your long Zen practice affected your life as a Catholic? Is there a dominant way it has, or has it permeated? I have a lot more to say on that, but if a student were to come to you at SMU, for example, and say, what is the most important thing Zen has taught you about being a Catholic? What might you say?
The one word that jumps up is love. Love, not in a romantic sense, of course, but the love that underlies everything. When you look at the trees, the sky, the stars, and other people, somehow there's that pervading sense of wanting to hug them and wanting to really be grateful for each and everything. And somehow that ties in with what we learn in our Christian understanding, that God so loved the world to become this very flesh of ours. And so that flesh seeks to give itself to all so that we may be all wrapped in that same love.
That's so moving. I really feel that, Ruben.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now I'll move to reading you some of the questions, although I think you can see them as well.
Please, but help me. There
Absolutely.
are questions that, yes, please read some of the salient ones.
Thomas's was the first, so I'll read it from the chat, but I think it's accessible to you as well.
Yes.
Ruben, this is Thomas. I was wondering whether you can say more about what you perceive to be the inadequacy of pluralism. Many would view this as the solution to the creeping imperialism of, say, inclusivism. What about the mutuality model put forth by Paul Knitter? Could that be a viable alternative in your opinion?
Thank you. I appreciate that question because that's the kind of thing I'm dealing with in my classes also. So the weakness of the pluralism model in its stark form is that it tends to relativize our understanding of our faith, and so that Christianity becomes just one among others. And so if a Buddhist would also see that, no, I feel that my tradition is really valid, and yet I acknowledge your tradition, but I don't want to relativize it. I don't want to just make it one among others. And so, so with the Hindu, they would say, oh, everything comes from Brahman in so many different forms. So if you look at it that way, we need at least a standpoint that will enable us to embrace the whole and not just say, okay, I'm a Christian, so that's good with me, but you can be a Hindu and you can be a Buddhist, or you can be an atheist, and I'm good with that. That stark pluralist point of view somehow does not tally, and somehow there's something lacking there. So I'm looking for something that may at least bring us together in a divine dance wherein we can acknowledge our respective uniquenesses and acknowledge our gifts to one another without relativizing them. So again, it's a subtle play on words, you might say, but that's why I call it a reverse kind of inclusivism. I cannot be complete without you joining me in my life, although you are a totally other in terms of religion and in terms of beliefs and in terms of culture. I need you to be me. It's that kind of way of relating to other religions that I hope we can more cultivate, respecting our differences. That's not the pluralism that we talk about, but it's some kind of pluralism, some kind of inclusivism, but we have to really strip those words of their conventional meanings.
Thank you, Ruben. And I will pull out still from that question then simply, what do you think about the mutuality model put forth by Paul Knitter?
Yes.
That's part of this discussion?
Right. Somehow mutuality is resonant with what I'm trying to say, except that in the way that the mutuality model is presented, it's okay, we can help one another, but I don't need to engage with you since you have your thing and so on. So there, maybe it's just a failure of language to convey what we want to say. So Paul Knitter also has the fourth model called the acceptance model. I accept you for what you are, while I stand firm in my own belief, and I allow you to influence me by our friendship, by our cooperation, and so on. So that's also something that I would support. And I would like to add, though, that precisely it's not just being hospitable to you, but I also need you precisely so that I can be me. So there's more than just acceptance, but an engaging kind of acceptance, which I would like to emphasize there.
Thank you.
Thomas, we need to talk. Let's have some discussions.
There we go. It can continue offline. So the next question is from Andrew Keener.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read that. Thank you for your really wonderful presentation, Professor Habito. I'm coming to your talk from the perspective of literary studies, and I have a question about the irony of the Christian mission as it played out in Scorsese's film and in Endo's novel. Hundreds of years later, what responsibilities do modern storytellers or artists or scholars have in retelling the history of Catholicism in 16th/17th century Japan, especially the presumptions of exclusive salvation on the part of Christians and state executions on the part of the Japanese governors? What are the biggest challenges for this work? What does one's own faith have to do with it? So I'll copy that and put it in the chat in case it's easier for you to see it that way.
I see that. I saw that in the question and answer. Thank you. That's a big one, and that's really a good one. And I would like to discuss with Andrew some more of the nuances, because I love this question because it takes us into so many intricacies. My very simplistic response, preliminary, I hope you don't take this as my entire response, but I hope we can engage in some conversation, either email or in a phone conversation later, is precisely the irony, the to put it in Latin, the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites in all of these, the suffering and yet the salvation. For example, in the priest who renounced Christianity so that he could be one with the people. Is he a heretic or is he a hero? Is he not? So one way of seeing it is, what does the crucified Christ mean? And so precisely that kind of, you use the word irony, and that's exactly it. We need to be aware of the irony in our human events and in our human life, that we don't just take things in a one-sided way, and be able to listen to those different nuances that seem to be contradictory and yet somehow lead us to a realm that we can only stand in awe in silence. Again, I'm not exhausting the conversation here, but I appreciate your question. And so Endo's novel ends in an open kind of way, and it's up to the reader to discern where you are, what stand to take, and so that's why it's a very, very powerful film as such, and the book. So thank you so much for that question, which I'm not able to answer adequately, but I would like to just appreciate the nuance of that.
Thank you, Ruben. So now our next question is from an anonymous attendee. How do you deal with the contradiction between direct timeline view of Christianity and the circular view of being reborn?
Thank you. I am still, I can say the jury is still out on that one. It's not that I'm escaping, but that's a perennial question. My spouse and I also are both Catholics and Buddhist practitioners. She translates for Dharma Master, who is based in Taiwan, to German retreatants in Germany. And so these things come up and we discuss these things, and how do you settle this? So again, if I may offer at least some thread of a hint that I'm pursuing, the same thing, the coincidentia oppositorum. Two conceptual opposites somehow converge in a way that becomes alive in the now. The fact that we will have a chance to write, to make things right by being given another life gives us hope. But at the same time, the fact that here and now, everything is at stake. So those two need to be seen in, not so much in conflict and in contradiction, but as in mutually reinforcing ways. And again, the so-called mystery of the Trinity, not so-called, but the mystery of the Trinity is something that I take as a hint. Catholics have to affirm that God is one and only one. And yet at the same time, in the same breath, Catholics have to affirm that God is three, and not just one with three divisions, or not three that are just simply bound up together in one organizational unity, but three, period, one period, a stark contradiction. And that's what the entire Catholic faith is banking on. We're living in a contradiction. So how can we live that? So I suppose those two worldviews, the cyclic worldview and the timeline, the linear worldview, somehow need to find an interplay in which they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know how to articulate that, but somehow those two have valid ways of looking at what our destiny is, and we need to listen to both and be more fully who we are.
Thank you, Ruben. So this next question is from a religious studies alum, Cameron Heon. Can you talk more about the intermonastic approach to interreligious dialogue? Specifically, were there any conflicts which arose either in your experience or study of Zen monks and Christian priests living in the same space? If so, how were these tensions approached or resolved?
I see, thank you. Well, there was a lot of harmony for one, especially when people were in silence, but the tensions and the awkwardness came in the liturgy. In the Catholic liturgy, there is that canonical mandate that only those who fully believe in the transubstantiation of this bread into the body and blood of Christ are welcomed into communion. That's why if you go to a normal Catholic church on a Sunday, they would say, those who are baptized Catholics, please line up. Those who are not, if you want to come and receive a blessing, come up and put your palms like this and so on. Somehow those who are not admitted into a communion feel, okay, we're up to you, but we're with you on all things except this point. So somehow they still feel excluded. I'm not going to say where how I would address that myself, but I can speak privately. But what is the one body of Christ that we are all invited to be partakers of? And so so now how can we look at the canonical provisions of the Catholic Church and revisit them in the light of a greater vision, just like extra ecclesiam nulla salus, not to limit it into a very strict framework that humans can control, but to really see it from the perspective of God. For those who are, so the Methodists have a more inclusive way. This is not the Methodist Eucharist. This is not this is not the pastors or ministers Eucharist. This is Christ inviting everyone who feels called to join, and so on. Anyway, that's one of those tensions that I remember arising. And there were some they expressed it. We had some kind of open sessions in which that kind of hurt was also expressed from those who were not Catholic.
Thank you, Ruben. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but we'll turn to our last question. Forgive me, I think I might mispronounce your name, the person who wrote this question, Malaswara. You spoke about multi-religious belonging. What are the measures to be taken while embracing many religious treasures?
That's a great question, and we need to continue talking about that. And Sarita, I'm sure you would have some perspectives on this also. But first, respect, and then integrity. Not just to take this because I like this and I don't like the others and so on, and then therefore I'm a multi-religious belonger because I do Zen and I also do this other thing and I go to church, but to really respect the traditions in their integrity and be fully committed to both. Can we do that? How can, anyway, that deserves some discussion, but I would stop at that right now. Fully committed to both, and not just I'm partly this and I'm partly that. Is that possible? Is the question.
So that we don't have other questions, but we still have a little time. So if others have more questions, please provide them, but I certainly have a few other things I would love to know or to build on.
Please.
And Ruben, since we both share being Catholic and Zen, one way that I've navigated this contradiction in terms of dual religious belonging is to sort of take refuge in the anti-intellectualism of Zen. So for example, you can imagine with my late teacher, Darlene Cohen, constant questions. What about rebirth? What about religious conflict? What about this? What about that? And then since most of my peers left behind their original religion and only embraced Zen, I was sometimes an outlier in this area. And so, for example, on the question of rebirth, what I focus on is forgetting about that and instead the birth and death of the present moment. So, which actually I think you eloquently touched on yourself. So the practical side of it provides a sideways response, I think. And so has that practical application piece enhanced your theological work then, in terms of finding ways out of these sticky questions that are abstract?
Perhaps the way I will respond to that is by side-swiping it, because you use the word theological, and that's a realm that I feel I need to delve into more. I've been writing books about practice and guidelines for practice up to this point, but I feel that theological discourse can be an important way for those who are seeking something genuine, can be guided to some directions that will lead them to an encounter with mystery. And for that, I would like to appeal or call for a remarriage of theology and spirituality. Since the Enlightenment, so-called, in European history, the separation of reason, and or rather the enshrinement of reason as the queen of all, and then everything else, like other aspects of humanity, are somehow relegated to other lower aspects. In theological disciplines, systematic theology has become, well, the queen of theological sciences, so to speak, and so-called spirituality or spiritual theology is a kind of a sub-discipline that is set aside for those who want to do some practical stuff. Okay, but the real heart of the matter is systematic theology and so on, and that has led to an unfortunate rift. We have many people who are walking with big heads, but their hearts are undeveloped, and so it's a call for bringing those two together again, so that whatever we say from a theological point of view, theological meaning God talk, referring to that divine mystery, is something that does not just breed more concepts and more ideas about divine reality, but somehow brings forth the person who is trying to do God talk, the theologian, to a direct encounter with that mystery. And so the theologian also needs to be aware of that realm of encounter with divine mystery, in short, to cultivate one's spiritual senses, so that one can talk theologically in a way that connects with that and not have those two in separate realms. I hope that more and more of our colleagues can really move together in this direction, and that's one of the tasks I feel I need to spend some more time and effort in.
So I think we're nearing the end of our time, but I could talk another 3 hours about this very issue, the separation of mystical theology and systematics. And in fact, I left systematics for that very reason. And so pulling the mind down into the heart, and that religious experience should result in the virtues, not in condescension.
Exactly.
I find that very rich, and perhaps a fitting way to end our evening, that Zen practice, at least for me, has provided that additional piece of acceptance and transformation to complement my own Catholic reality.
Thank you. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to reconnect with you, Sarita, and thank Aaron for your very adept organizational skills to put us all together and have these kinds of conversations that will now affect the way we do things from here on. Thank you. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
The last words are yours, Aaron, and maybe Thomas, coming from the darkness.
Oh, I just want to, I don't know that I have anything nearly as insightful as both of you have offered us tonight. So I just want to end by thanking both of you, for Dr. Habito for a wonderful talk, and then both of you and Dr. Tamayo-Moraga for this conversation that I think really illuminated many of these things. And I think we're very lucky to be able to be here with y'all's conversation and to take away a lot from that. So thank you very much. Thank you all who were able to attend, and hopefully these conversations will continue on online. Hopefully one day in kind of in person, we'll be back there. But thank you all.
And thank you. I thank all of those who raised questions in the chat and Q&A. I apologize for not being able to address them thoroughly, but I really appreciate each one of those, and they're always going to be something that I'll continue thinking about. So please, if you feel drawn, please engage me as an invitation. My email is rhabito@smu.edu, and I'd be grateful for further communications. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night and good luck.